How many times a day do you rely on technology that uses artificial intelligence? It's probably more often than you think. It's in your home if you have smart speakers, or in your pocket if you own a cell phone.
When you speak commands into your iPhone, Siri is able to recognize the words that you say and act on them. When you open up Facebook, Facebook can recognize faces and other objects in the photos you post there.
That's Cade Metz, a technology correspondent at the New York Times and author of the book Genius Makers, The Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the World. He says the term artificial intelligence was first coined in the late 1950s by a small group of scientists attending a conference at Dartmouth College. There, they brainstormed the endless possibilities of software that could act as a neural network to reproduce the behavior of a human brain. But what exactly is this artificial neural network? How does it work?
The neural network is essentially a mathematical system that can learn a skill by analyzing data. So a great example is if you give a neural network thousands of cat photos, it analyzes those photos and it learns to recognize the patterns that define what a cat looks like. So in analyzing thousands of those images, it learns to recognize a cat. That's what's going on Facebook when it recognizes faces in your photos.
Metz highlights that this technology goes further than recognition. Flip it the other way around, and it can generate text, images, sounds, and full dialogue from what it's learned. And these systems are always evolving as they process more data and get computer upgrades. But go back 70 years, and this level of machine learning was hard to even fathom.
Back in the 50s, Cornell University professor named Frank Rosenblatt built a system that could do this, but only with printed letters. So he could print a giant letter A or a letter B on a large card, and the system, in analyzing these cards, could learn to recognize these printed letters. That worked well enough, but we didn't have the amount of data and the processing power, the computer processing power we needed to make it work with more complex tasks. And it would take decades, half a century, before we got to that point.
Many of the early pioneers of artificial intelligence faced a mountain of doubt from people both inside and outside the field. It's hard to develop ideas when the technology just wasn't there to back it up. Yet today, it's a much different picture. The industry has leapt forward with many big breakthroughs, from driverless cars to the use of AI in prosthetic limbs and drug design. One challenge, however, is the ability for these machines to replicate human reasoning, which doesn't follow a clear set of rules.
A neural network is very good at recognizing patterns and even generating its own content, but it cannot reason. And we still don't know how to build a system that can reason. And that's, as I alluded to earlier, that's one of the flaws in self-driving cars, that they're so good at doing so many things, but they can't reason. And it's hard for self-driving cars to deal, with those uncertain situations that require reasoning that we humans have. And even in these systems that are working very well in other areas, it's not just self-driving cars, it's self-flying drones, it's other types of robotics. It's now, and this is an important area at the moment, systems that can understand human language, and in some ways they can start to carry on a conversation. And they're good at carrying a conversation for a few turns, right? For a few phrases back and forth with you, but then it starts to break down as you get deeper into this conversation.
Metz says that this ability to respond in real time like a human requires many factors like built-in reasoning, memory, and learned experience. But as AI evolves, there's also another conversation happening. How far do we want these machines to go?
Everywhere we turn, it seems, there are these ethical questions, right? The same technology that can be used to build a self-driving car can be applied to autonomous drones, as I said, and you can put a weapon on a drone. And the threat of autonomous weapons where humans are out of the loop, that's been a real concern for a long time. And there are companies that are pushing towards this type of situation. Startups that are building autonomous drones, they're building them for the military, they're willing to put weapons on them, and it becomes a question of, when do you keep the human in the loop? When do you use these and when do you not? And that's just one of the ethical questions. These systems, because they learn from us, essentially, right? They learn from the data we choose to give it. They learn from text that we have posted to the internet over many, many years. We as humans are flawed, and these systems, in learning from our data, they pick up our flaws.
These human biases that are coded into the algorithms of machine learning systems are only exacerbated as the technology becomes more complex and human-like. In addition, much of this field is driven by tech companies in the private sector, like Google and Tesla, who have one goal in mind at the end of the day: profit.
So much of the data that you need to build this, the processing power, and the talent, the researchers, the scientists you need to build this, they're inside these very large companies, right? They're not inside the government. It's a shift from years past when it comes to just, say, autonomous weapons and this type of thing. The technology is inside the Googles and the Facebooks. It's not inside the DoD. And there are all sorts of concerns there, and there are efforts to kind of bridge that gap, and there's been some progress. But it's hard to deal with because the imbalance in terms of money is there, and there are other reasons that people are moving into industry as opposed to government. And the other big problem is that these companies have their own motivations, right? These are public companies that need to make money, and they need to get technology out. And lots of times that happens at the expense of other things.
Last year's election was a prime example of the immense power that tech giants hold. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter moderated the millions of conversations happening on news feeds and worked around the clock to stop the flourishing spread of disinformation sweeping across their sites.
We've seen over the past 4 years what kind of problems that can bring, and the technology is relatively simple at this point. What happens when it's more complicated, right? These systems are starting, like I said, to generate not only their own images but their own text. And that means there are a lot of ways that can be used in positive ways, but it also means that we're reaching the point where systems can generate this sort of disinformation on a scale that humans cannot. And when we get to that point, then it really becomes dangerous, where the volume of disinformation is so great and the disinformation itself is so good, it looks so much like the real thing, that we start to enter this world where we can't really be sure what we're looking at or what we're reading.
Metz argues that the tech field is still somewhat divided over the controversies and issues surrounding artificial intelligence.
A lot of people from outside and inside these companies have called attention to a lot of these issues. At the same time, there's a lot of conflict here, and people see a lot of these issues differently and from various sides. And you see that within many of these large companies where part of the workforce will come down on one side of it and the other part will come down on another. So we're definitely looking harder at this stuff, but the question mark certainly hangs over all this, and we wonder where ultimately this is going to go.
Who knows what the field will look like even 5 or 10 years from now? It could be an entirely different landscape than the image we picture today. To find out more about the field of artificial intelligence and our guest, Cade Metz, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also check out his book, Genius Makers, the Mavericks Who Brought AI to Google, Facebook, and the World, available online and in bookstores. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zoveri. I'm Gary Price.
Two nationwide surveys find that discrimination is a significant barrier to care for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Half or more of non-white Alzheimer's caregivers report they face discrimination in navigating health care for their recipient. Dr. Carl V. Hill is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of the Alzheimer's Association.
The data suggests we have a long way to go to address lack of health equity in healthcare. More than 80% of non-white racial and ethnic groups say it's important for Alzheimer's care providers to understand their backgrounds and experiences. But fewer than half of Blacks and only about 60% of Hispanics and Asian Americans feel confident about their access to culturally competent providers.
The surveys also reveal a lack of trust among Blacks in research clinical trials, and half doubt that advances in Alzheimer's treatments would be shared. These findings are part of the 2021 Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures Report. Find out more at alz.org/facts.
Limited availability of COVID-19 vaccines means testing will remain important for work, travel, and preventing disease spread. A recent national survey shows widespread confusion about COVID-19 testing. Less than a third of people surveyed know the difference between PCR-based and rapid antigen-based technologies, and more than half say it doesn't matter what kind of test you get. Dr. Manoj Gandhi, Senior Medical Director at Thermo Fisher Scientific, which commissioned the survey, says accuracy doubts could keep people from being tested at all.
Nearly two-thirds of those surveyed believe COVID-19 tests can be wrong as much as half the time. PCR tests are designed to detect SARS-CoV-2 with high sensitivity. Understanding when to use PCR tests is imperative to knowing your COVID-19 status and safely getting back to life's routine activities.
Nearly 3/4 of Americans say they'd choose a COVID-19 test with the most accurate results, even if they have to wait a little longer. Find out more at covidtestinginfographic.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
For decades, people would say, oh, well, wait till big pharma comes in, wait till big tobacco comes in. Well, you missed the real big, quote-unquote, player, and that's big cannabis.
Understanding the rapidly evolving cannabis industry. Then,
it is the only sorting method that has so far been devised where the person looking things up doesn't need to know anything.
Where would we be without the A to Z method of organizing information? I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.